Shadows after Rome. When the Western Roman Empire fell in the late 5th century, the sun seemed to set on a world that had once called itself eternal. Rome had been a city of marble, of aqueducts pouring water across hills, of legions stamping the rhythm of order from Britain to the Nile. Its emperors, flawed though they were, had claimed to be the guardians of civilization itself. And then, with startling speed, the scaffolding collapsed. In 476 CE, the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed, and the Western throne was left empty. What followed was not a single, clean break, but rather the slow dimming of light across Europe. Trade networks frayed, literacy, once a badge of prestige, dwindled, the hum of urban life thinned into the silence of smaller, fortified settlements. Yet the fall was never absolute. The eastern half of the empire, Byzantium, continued on, gleaming in Constantinople, with scholars still debating whether the East's survival exaggerated the West's decline. To those who lived through the change in Gaul, in Italy, or along the Rhine, it must have felt like the floor beneath history had given way. Roman roads still cut straight lines across the continent, but caravans that once thundered with goods now crept along with suspicion, wary of bandits and shifting warlords. Archaeological evidence paints this transformation vividly. In Britain, for example, coin circulation dried up within a generation of Rome's departure. Sites like Wroxeter reveal cities that once held bustling forums, reduced to makeshift barns built within decaying walls. Scholars still debate whether this was a collapse or simply a transformation, whether people were forced into hardship, or whether local communities simply reshaped themselves in ways our later eyes mistake for decay. One curious tidbit comes from the kingdom of the Franks, who rose from seeming obscurity in this vitos cities. Oid, Clovis, their warrior king around the year 500, wore not a Roman laurel but the pelt of battle. His conversion to Christianity is remembered as a pivotal act, but the sources around it are coloured by legend, and we must ask how much was political theatre. Did Clovis see faith as a shield, or was his baptism a crafted story to align barbarian might with papal blessing? The very ambiguity reveals how, in this age, fact and myth dance together in the record. If we listen closely to the chroniclers who did survive, we hear more silence than clarity. Gregory of Tours, writing in the 6th century, gives us glimpses of plagues sweeping across Gaul, of a comet streaking through the heavens, of kings rising and falling with violence. His Latin is broken, his narrative stitched with miracles. To later historians, it is both invaluable and unreliable. Was he witnessing the unravelling of civilization, or was he simply writing with the narrow vision of a bishop in one battered city? Meanwhile, in Rome itself, once the heart of empire, goats grazed in the shadow of the Colosseum. Marble slabs were plucked from ancient temples to build churches, a symbolic recycling of the old world into the new. Imagine walking through those ruins in the 6th century, fragments of grandeur underfoot, the echo of chants in basilicas that replaced the roar of gladiators. It was a world at once ancient and newborn, and yet, even as ruins loomed, something more unsettling was happening. The sense of time itself was shifting. With no emperor to anchor the calendar, years seemed to blur. Chronicles were sparse, events misdated, annals confused. Centuries later, scholars would look back at this twilight and wonder, were these years truly lived as recorded, or had some been misplaced, duplicated, or invented altogether? That question would haunt the very idea of the Dark Ages, for in the shadow of Rome, history itself seemed to slip out of joint, a century of silence. The centuries immediately after Rome's collapse are often painted in shades of darkness, and nowhere is this gloom more striking than in the written record. For an empire that once produced scrolls in abundance, from the speeches of Cicero to the bureaucratic minutiae of imperial tax receipts, the sudden silence feels like a vanishing act. The Latin world, so verbose for centuries, seemed to lose its voice. Take the year 536 CE, for instance. A Byzantine chronicler, Procopius, reported that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. Other scattered sources from Ireland to China confirm strange skies and crop failures. Modern scholars often link this to volcanic eruptions that cast dust into the atmosphere, creating what some describe as the worst year to be alive. And yet, in the West, almost nothing coherent survives to anchor this catastrophe. The chronicles are skeletal, fragments of fasting monks, whispers of famines, legends of locusts. Scholars still debate whether the darkness was as global as these scattered mentions suggest, or whether later writers retrofitted memory into myth. This absence is not just the result of parchment decaying or archives burning. There is something structural in the silence. The very people who could write, monks, bishops, court clerks, were often embroiled in survival or power struggles, their priorities skewed away from record-keeping. In Merovingian Gaul, kings came and went with alarming frequency, but official histories are little more than hagiographies of saints and miracle stories. It is as if time itself was marked not by politics or inventions, but by relics discovered, visions reported, or holy men wandering through fields. One quirky tidbit survives from the annals of northern Italy, a note about a battle interrupted by a swarm of bees. Warriors scatter. D in panic, the chronicler says, believing divine punishment had descended. Was this simply folklore, or did an actual swarm derail a skirmish that otherwise would have slipped entirely from memory? These small curiosities remind us how much of daily reality has been lost, and how arbitrary the fragments can feel. Archaeology adds to the mystery. In some regions, centuries appear almost empty of human presence. Pottery styles freeze, settlement layers thin, and coins vanish. In Bavaria, entire decades seem archaeologically silent. Some scholars argue this reflects population decline. Others whisper about the possibility that those missing years may never have existed as recorded. Scholars still debate whether we are staring at gaps in history or gaps created by history. The Byzantines, who continued to write more steadily, give us some perspective. Their chronicles in Constantinople detail emperors, wars with Persia, and the flow of events. But when we try to align them with the patchy Western record, the timelines wobble. Characters seem to appear too early or too late. An emperor in the East is celebrated in year X, but in the West his shadow falls in year Y. Could this be a symptom of miscopied dates, or does it hint at something more deliberate? This century of silence is not total emptiness, but rather a fog through which we glimpse torchlight, and fog is fertile ground for invention. Later chroniclers, writing in the 9th or 10th centuries, would retroactively stitch stories into this void, creating neat successions, moral tales, and divinely ordered timelines where perhaps only confusion once reigned. Imagine standing in a monastery library in the 7th century. Shelves are bare compared to Rome's archives. A monk, labouring by candlelight, copies an older manuscript with trembling hand, perhaps inserting a date he believes must be correct, perhaps smoothing over a year he cannot explain. In those choices, history itself is shaped. The silence is not merely an absence, it is an invitation to rewrite. And so, the Dark Ages begin, not with chaos alone, but with memory fractured into rumour. Monks with pens. Into this silence, monks entered as unlikely custodians of time. The collapse of civic life had left few institutions capable of recording or remembering. In the absence of bureaucrats and scribes, the monastery became the heart of memory. Behind stone walls, cloistered from the violence of warlords and shifting borders, men with quills bent over parchment, copying, preserving, and sometimes reshaping the past. The scriptorium, that workshop of memory, was no ordinary place. Picture a long hall lit by narrow windows, the scrape of reed pens against vellum, and the faint smell of ink. A monk might spend months copying a single text, his fingers cramping as he traced out words whose meaning he might not even fully understand. These manuscripts were not produced for mass circulation, but for survival, a fragile bridge between antiquity and whatever future might come. One of the most vivid examples comes from Ireland, where monasteries like Clonmacnoise and Iona became islands of literacy amid a largely illiterate landscape. There, monks preserved not just sacred scripture, but fragments of classical texts, Virgil, Ovid, and Aristotle. Without these quiet labourers, vast stretches of ancient literature might have vanished forever, and yet, in the act of copying, they also transformed. Margins filled with commentary, genealogies of local kings were inserted beside biblical chronologies. A monk's pen could just as easily preserve as it could reframe. There's a quirky detail about one such monk in the 7th century. In a manuscript now housed in Switzerland, a copyist grew frustrated and scrawled in the margin, "Oh my hand," a very human sigh across 13 centuries. Another doodled a small fish beside a psalm, as if to lighten the weight of holy labour. These playful fragments remind us that history is not only high politics and grand events, it is also to "he weary hand of a man in a cold room, leaving behind a complaint no emperor would have thought worth recording." But the power of the monastic pen went far beyond doodles. By shaping chronologies, monks influenced how entire centuries were remembered. The Easter tables, complex charts to calculate the date of Easter, became unexpectedly one of the primary ways years were marked and synchronized across Christendom. Yet these tables are riddled with anomalies. Some scholars still debate whether gaps and duplications in these charts are innocent errors of arithmetic or signs of deliberate tampering with time. If a date is misaligned in an Easter calculation, does it ripple across every annal that relied on it? Perhaps. The Venerable Bede, writing in the early 8th century, is a towering example of the monastic historian. In his ecclesiastical history of the English people, he created a framework for England's story, tying pagan pasts neatly into Christian destiny. But even Bede, diligent as he was, leaned on sources that were fragmentary, oral, or already suspect. He invented continuity where gaps yawned. His decision to date events Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, anchored time to Christ, but it also subtly reset the clock of history itself. And here lies the deeper puzzle. Were monks faithfully recording what they saw, or were they constructing a usable past for communities desperate for order? Scholars still debate whether the Dark Ages record reflects lived reality or retrospective storytelling sanctified by ink. The line between chronicler and creator was often perilously thin. As the quills scratched and the candles burned, these monks with pens ensured that history did not vanish completely, but they also left us with something stranger, a memory stitched together like a patchwork quilt with seams that do not always align. And in those seams, centuries later would emerge suspicions of the greatest cover-up of all, Charlemagne's miracle. Amid the patchwork of silence and scriptoria, one figure looms larger than most. Charlemagne, the Frankish king crowned as Emperor of the Romans in the year 800. His story is told with such grandeur that it often feels like a miracle staged in the middle of darkness. Here was a man said to have united half of Europe under his banner, to have sparked a cultural revival, and to have restored the prestige of Rome itself. and yet, when we peer closely at his reign, the light flickers strangely, and the timeline begins to feel unsettled. Contemporaries describe Charlemagne as a towering figure, broad of chest, fierce in war, and tireless in his patronage of learning. In Aachen, his capital, he built the Palatine Chapel, whose octagonal dome still stands today, an echo of Byzantine grandeur transplanted into the forests of Germany. He invited scholars from across Europe, Alcuin of York among them, to teach grammar, astronomy, and theology. This so-called Carolingian Renaissance gave us clearer scripts, copied texts, and an effort to standardize Latin. For generations, it was celebrated as the rebirth of civilization. But here, the miracle sharpens into mystery. Historians began noticing, particularly in the 20th century, that records of Charlemagne and his dynasty are strangely abundant compared to the centuries before and after. The so-called Annals of the Kingdom of the Franks appear polished, almost suspiciously neat in their chronology. Battles are described with biblical flourish, victories stack one upon another, and the king's destiny unfolds like a divinely written script. Scholars still debate whether this was faithful reporting or a conscious effort by court scholars to construct an empire not only in stone but in narrative. One quirky detail illustrates this tension. The emperor is said to have stood 7 feet tall, a giant Ammon, G. Men. When his tomb was opened in the 9th century, chroniclers claimed to see his body seated upright on a throne, sword in hand, as though still reigning in death. Later, in 1861, his bones were examined, and they belonged to a man just over 6 feet. Large, yes, but not the mythical colossus the legends promised. Even in the details of his physique, we see how memory was magnified, bent toward myth. And then comes the problem of time itself. Some revisionist historians, most controversially Heribert Illig in the 1990s, proposed that Charlemagne's reign, and indeed nearly 3 centuries of early medieval history, were invented wholesale. According to this phantom time hypothesis, the years 614 to 911 CE were artificially inserted, either through error or deliberate manipulation, to make political claims align with prophecy. In this reading, Charlemagne was not just embellished, but perhaps an entirely fabricated emperor. Scholars still debate whether this theory has any merit. It is widely dismissed in mainstream academia, but the very fact that it can be proposed speaks to the odd density of Charlemagne's story in a field of surrounding emptiness. Meanwhile, Byzantine records offer their own puzzles. The Emperor Constantine VI in the East reigned during Charlemagne's time, but when cross-referenced, the timelines do not perfectly align. Was this simply the normal chaos of medieval dating, or does it hint at deeper chronological distortions? The coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III in 800 CE becomes not just a grand moment of rebirth, but also a fulcrum on which centuries of uncertainty balance. If Charlemagne was real, and the stones of Aachen, the manuscripts of his scholars, and the legacy of his empire argue that he was also a carefully sculpted figure. His miracle was not just the unification of Europe, but the crafting of memory itself. A king, a symbol, perhaps even a temporal anchor placed into history like a keystone. In the glow of his story, the centuries before and after fade all the more into shadow, leaving us to wonder whether the brilliance of Charlemagne's miracle blinds us to the fractures in time that surround him. The Phantom Years. Out of all the puzzles of the so-called Dark Ages, none has stirred as much fascination and controversy as the theory of phantom years. The idea, shocking in its implications, suggests that a large portion of early medieval history never happened at all. Entire centuries, some claim, may have been invented, duplicated, or misplaced in the annals of time. And at the centre of this strange hypothesis sits Charlemagne, whose grandeur we've just witnessed, now cast in an unsettling new light. The phantom time hypothesis, proposed in the 1990s by German historian Heribert Illig, argues that the years between 614 and 911 CE were artificially inserted into the record. According to Illig, the early Middle Ages are not simply dark because they lack evidence. They are dark because they never existed. In this view, we are not living in the 21st century, but in the 18th, our calendars padded with phantom centuries. It is a proposal that borders on heresy to mainstream historians, yet one that refuses to die in the popular imagination. What evidence gave rise to such a claim? Partly, the gaps we have already seen, centuries of silence in the archaeological record, empty decades in the soil, and manuscripts that appear suspiciously polished. Illig and others pointed to anomalies in architecture as well. For example, Romanesque styles appear in the 10th century with a maturity that suggests a long tradition behind them. Where, then, are the intermediary structures? Did builders leap directly from late Roman brickwork to soaring medieval arches, skipping 3 centuries of evolution? Scholars still debate whether these leaps are the result of missing evidence or whether something stranger is at play. One quirky tidbit often cited in this context comes from the coronation year of 1000 CE. Chroniclers across Europe expected apocalyptic signs as the first millennium closed, yet the record is strangely muted. There is little panic, little evidence of widespread millennial terror. Was this because the year 1000 was not truly the 1000th year since Christ's birth, but an artificially advanced date? The silence surrounding what should have been a moment of cosmic dread adds fuel to the fire. The theory also draws attention to discrepancies in Byzantine and Islamic records. When aligned with Western chronologies, events sometimes appear to overlap or misdate by decades. A Persian astronomer's observation might coincide with a Byzantine emperor who, according to Western reckoning, should not yet exist. Scholars still debate whether these mismatches are innocent copying errors, scribal mistakes, or signs of something more deliberate. At the heart of the hypothesis is the suspicion of deliberate manipulation. Some versions suggest that Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II, in the year 1000, wanted to place themselves at the dawn of a new millennium. By fabricating Charlemagne's empire and inserting centuries of narrative, they could claim continuity and legitimacy as the heirs of a revived Rome. It is a dramatic idea that time itself was stretched to serve politics. Mainstream historians reject Illig's claims, pointing to evidence such as dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, which shows continuous growth across the so-called phantom centuries, and radiocarbon dating that anchors artifacts firmly in the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries. And yet, even as the hypothesis is dismissed, it casts a long shadow. For it highlights just how fragile our chronology is, how reliant it is on a chain of manuscripts and assumptions, and how easily gaps invite speculation. Imagine, then, living in a world where centuries may be illusions, where the stone churches of the 9th century might stand not as ancient monuments, but as relatively recent creations, their backstories scripted after the fact. Even if the phantom time hypothesis is wrong, the unease it stirs is real. That history, like parchment, can be stretched, thinned, or even forged entirely. And so the phantom years hover like ghosts, perhaps not real, perhaps invented, but always reminding us how perilous it is to take the passage of time for granted. Omissions in stone. If words can be manipulated, we might expect stone to stand firm. After all, buildings endure where manuscripts crumble. Cathedrals, palaces, and fortifications should provide a physical timeline immune to scribes' errors. Yet when we examine the architectural record of the early Middle Ages, we discover long stretches of omission, centuries where stone seems to have fallen silent. Consider Western Europe in the period supposedly spanning the 7th through 9th centuries. Roman aqueducts and amphitheatres still dotted the land, relics of an older glory, but new monumental building projects are strangely scarce. Where the empire once built in marble, brick and concrete, the successors often built in timber and earth, leaving few traces for archaeologists to uncover. The result is a gap so pronounced that even seasoned historians struggle to find substantial structures dated securely to these years. Scholars still debate whether this is due to economic collapse, the impermanence of wooden architecture, or the absence of the centuries themselves. One vivid example comes from Rome itself. Between the 6th century and the Carolingian revival, the Eternal City shrank dramatically. The Colosseum became a quarry, its stones carted away to patch churches and houses. Yet large-scale new construction is barely recorded. The Lateran and St. Peter's saw some renovations, but the leap from decaying classical monuments to the Romanesque basilicas of the 10th and 11th centuries feels abrupt, as though intermediate stages were erased. Was this truly a barren pause in building, or the sign of phantom years inserted into the calendar? A quirky tidbit from England sharpens the point. At Sutton Hoo, the famous ship burial dated to the early 7th century dazzles with gold, garnet and craftsmanship rivaling the finest of Rome. Yet after this spectacular fin, d.e. the archaeological record plunges into obscurity. For nearly 2 centuries, little emerges that matches such artistry. Did the skills vanish, only to reappear later? Or are we missing a chapter of continuity, perhaps one that never existed? Scholars still debate whether Sutton Hoo represents the last flicker of late antiquity, or the misplaced glow of a much later age. Even Charlemagne's grand Palatine Chapel, celebrated as the seed of medieval architecture, carries puzzles. Its octagonal design echoes San Vitale in Ravenna, a 6th century Byzantine masterpiece. But how did such sophistication spring forth after centuries supposedly barren of stone construction? Was Aachen the miraculous rebirth historians proclaim, or evidence that those centuries of barrenness were, in some sense, inventions? Archaeology across Central Europe deepens the enigma. Entire towns appear to leap into existence around the 10th century, with little trace of precursor settlements. In some regions, the soil layers that should mark centuries of occupation are compressed or absent. Stratigraphy, the science of layering earth, often leaves archaeologists with uncomfortable questions. Why does one level dated to the 8th century sit so closely atop another from the 6th, with little to fill the space between? The earth itself seems to conspire with the silence of chronicles. And yet, explanations abound that do not invoke phantom years. Some historians argue that societies turned inward, building imperishable wood rather than stone. Others point to political instability, which funneled resources into survival rather than monumental display. It may be that the absence in stone reflects not fabrication but austerity. Scholars still debate whether we are staring at a void created by human choices, or a void created by human imagination centuries later. Imagine wandering across Europe in the so-called 8th century. You would find Roman ruins still dominating landscapes, villages clustered at their feet, wooden halls creaking in the wind, but little to suggest that time had marched centuries forward. Then, suddenly, in the record, stone returns in force. Castles, churches, bridges. The transition is so abrupt it almost feels like a missing heartbeat in history. Stone, we often trust, does not lie, but in the case of the Dark Ages, its omissions whisper just as loudly as the words of scribes. And in those whispers, the mystery of missing centuries deepens. Plague or propaganda? One of the most chilling features of the early Middle Ages is the recurrent spectre of plague. In the mid-6th century, the so-called Plague of Justinian swept through the Mediterranean world. Contemporary writers claimed that half of Constantinople perished, that fields lay fallow, and that corpses clogged the streets. If true, it was a catastrophe rivaling the Black Death of the 14th century. and yet when we try to trace its mark in Western Europe, the trail grows faint, almost suspiciously so. Was the plague truly as devastating as sources suggest, or was it a narrative, propaganda shaped by those who sought to explain collapse? Procopius, that ever-cynical Byzantine chronicler, describes bodies stacked like firewood, ships drifting unmanned because crews had died mid-voyage. Gregory of Tours echoes the horror in Gaul, noting famines and visions of doom. But the archaeological record is surprisingly muted. Unlike the Black Death, which left mass graves and a measurable demographic crater, the Justinianic plague leaves fewer scars in the soil. Scholars still debate whether the pathogen Yersinia pestis truly spread across all of Europe, or whether the silence in archaeology reflects exaggeration in writing. A curious tidbit comes from Bavaria. In the tiny cemetery of Aschheim, DNA analysis has indeed confirmed plague victims from the mid-6th century. Yet beyond such rare sites, evidence grows patchy. Some settlements decline, yes, but others continue undisturbed. Could it be that the plague was localized, its horror magnified by frightened chroniclers? Or did it indeed ravage widely, only to vanish in ways our records fail to capture? The political use of plague narratives cannot be ignored, for emperors like Justinian, describing pestilence as divine wrath, reinforced their role as mediators between heaven and earth. A city struck by Pete Plague could be reminded of its sins. An emperor could be cast as the chosen intercessor. In the West, bishops and abbots leaned on plague stories to argue for repentance, charity, or the power of saints' relics. A miracle attributed to a martyr could be woven into the narrative of deliverance. Plague, then, was as much a moral text as a medical reality. In some cases, the line between event and metaphor blurs almost completely. Irish annals speak of the Great Mortality and the Yellow Plague, but the descriptions are vague, sometimes indistinguishable from famine or war. Scholars still debate whether these annals describe repeated outbreaks of the same disease, or whether plague became a shorthand for any disaster. And the strangeness does not end there. Some modern climatologists suggest that volcanic eruptions in 536 and 540 created harvest failures that coincided with outbreaks of disease. In this view, plague may have been less an independent catastrophe than part of a cascade of disasters, famine, cold, and pestilence feeding one another. Others argue the timing has been exaggerated, the causal links forced into neat patterns by historians seeking drama. The uncertainty itself has become part of the mystery. Imagine being a villager in Gaul during these decades. One year, crops fail because the skies are strangely dim. The next, neighbours die in sudden fits. A bishop declares it is God's punishment. A rumour spreads that foreigners have poisoned wells. A monk dutifully records it all in trembling Latin. And centuries later, we are left with fragments that may be reality, myth, or both. If the plague was real, its silence in archaeology is troubling. If the plague was exaggerated, its persistence in chronicles is equally revealing. In either case, plague in the Dark Ages forces us to confront how easily suffering can be weaponized as story, and whether we see a biological catastrophe or a political metaphor, the plague remains another crack in the fragile edifice of early medieval time. Byzantine echoes. While the West stumbled through silence, the East continued to write. In Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, scribes busily recorded campaigns, councils, and court intrigues with a steadiness that makes the Western record look threadbare. Yet when historians attempt to align Byzantine chronicles with those of Western Europe, disquieting echoes appear. Dates fail to match. Events seem shifted. It is as if two orchestras were playing the same symphony, but one was several measures ahead or behind. The The Byzantine chronicler Theophanes the Confessor, writing in the early 9th century, produced an immense chronographia that synchronized Roman, Byzantine, and even Persian events. His annals provide precise dates, eclipses, and reigns, and yet, when cross-referenced with Western accounts, contradictions emerge. A solar eclipse recorded in Constantinople seems to fall in the wrong year according to Frankish annals. Battles in Italy appear twice, once in Byzantine memory, once in Carolingian, but with decades between them. Scholars still debate whether these are mere scribal mistakes or evidence of larger chronological distortions. One quirky detail highlights the oddity. Theophanes claims that Emperor Constantine V built a palace with water features so extravagant that mechanical lions roared and birds sang in golden trees. Western Europe, in this same period, supposedly wallowed in timber huts and silence. How can two regions existing side by side seem so different in technological sophistication? Was the East genuinely that advanced, or are we misdating events, compressing centuries in one region while stretching them in another? The Byzantines also had their own reasons to manipulate time. Emperors used history as a tool of legitimacy, drawing neat lines of succession from Rome to Constantinople. If that meant reshaping chronologies, merging events, or amplifying victories, they did so with confidence. But the sheer abundance of Byzantine sources, compared to Western scarcity, raises another suspicion. Did later Western chroniclers borrow Byzantine material, retrofitting it into their own timelines? Scholars still debate whether some Western history of the 7th to 9th centuries is in fact Byzantine history in disguise. Meanwhile, Arab and Persian sources complicate matters further. Muslim historians such as al-Tabari provide detailed accounts of the early caliphates, with firm anchors in astronomy and genealogy. Yet when their chronologies are compared to Byzantine and Western dates, overlaps and mismatches abound. Did a Byzantine emperor reign for decades longer in Eastern memory than in Western? Did a Frankish king appear late because his story was adapted second-hand? These discrepancies feed the unsettling possibility that our medieval timeline is less a single thread and more a tapestry woven with uneven strands. Imagine a scholar in Aachen around the year 800, struggling to situate Charlemagne within a world that included Byzantium, Baghdad, and distant China. His sources were patchy at best, hearsay at worst. To align them, he might stretch one date, compress another, and assume consistency where none existed. Centuries later, we inherit the patchwork and assume it is seamless. Byzantine echoes, then, serve as both reassurance and warning. They show us that history was indeed unfolding beyond the Alps, that cities still thrived, that scholars still wrote. But they also show us how fragile synchronization is. A single eclipse misplaced, a single reign miscalculated, and the entire chronology begins to wobble. And so, even in the luminous halls of Constantinople, we hear the same unsettling question whispered in the shadows of Roman Gaul. How much of this record is reality, and how much is reconstruction? The echoes grow louder as we try to reconcile East and West, suggesting that the Dark Ages may not simply have been dark, but disjointed. The lost inventions. History often moves in lines we expect: invention, refinement, replacement. But in the centuries we call the Dark Ages, technologies sometimes appear, vanish, and then reappear as though shuffled in a deck of cards. It is as if the timeline itself bent back on itself, allowing innovations to be discovered twice. This strange rhythm has led some to suspect not just cultural decline, but chronological distortion. Take the stirrup, for instance. In Asia, it had existed since at least the 4th century. In Europe, however, its appearance is strangely delayed. Archaeological finds suggest stirrups were in use in the 8th century, yet earlier chronicles are silent. When they finally enter the record, stirrups transform warfare, giving birth to the mounted knight. But why the gap? Did Europeans truly ignore such a simple, revolutionary tool for centuries, or was its story misplaced in time? Scholars still debate whether the stirrup's late arrival reflects genuine diffusion or chronological compression that obscures its path. Another puzzle lies in glassmaking. Roman artisans produced clear glass windows as early as the 1st century. After the empire's collapse, the skill seems to vanish in Western Europe, only to resurface much later in Carolingian and Romanesque churches. Did craftsmen truly forget for centuries how to make something their ancestors had perfected, or did the gap result from missing centuries in the record? The reappearance of technologies often feels less like rediscovery and more like a skipped page in history's book. A quirky tidbit comes from a 7th century text describing watermills. The author claims there were mills on nearly every river in Gaul, grinding grain with a mechanical efficiency Rome never fully exploited, and yet archaeology offers only sparse confirmation. By the 10th century, however, watermills explode across Europe. Did the 7th century claim exaggerate, or does it reflect a technological bloom we cannot properly locate on the timeline? Medicine offers another strange loop. Galen's classical texts dominated late antiquity, but by the early Middle Ages much of his knowledge seems absent in Western records. Then, suddenly, through Arabic translations, Galen returns in the 12th century, as if rediscovered. Scholars still debate whether Galen's influence was truly forgotten for centuries, or whether manuscripts survived quietly, their impact unrecorded until a later Renaissance. Even shipbuilding hints at missing links. The longships of the Vikings, appearing in the late 8th century, showcase a sophistication in design that feels abrupt. We see their sleek keels cutting across the seas, capable of both ocean voyages and shallow river raids. But what are their immediate precursors? Where is the transitional evidence between Roman merchant ships and Viking mastery? The archaeological trail is oddly thin. The explanation may lie in perishable materials. Wood, cloth, and leather do not endure like stone or metal, yet the pattern repeats so often that suspicion grows. Why do so many technologies seem to jump centuries as if lifted from antiquity and dropped into the High Middle Ages? Scholars still debate whether this pattern reflects genuine regression and rediscovery, or whether time itself has been miscounted. Imagine walking into a Carolingian workshop in the 9th century. On one bench, a scribe copies Virgil in a hand newly standardized. On another, a craftsman forges a lock whose design would not be seen again until the Renaissance. To our modern eyes, it looks anachronistic, a mixture of late Roman sophistication and medieval roughness. Perhaps it was. Perhaps that is exactly what the Dark Ages were, not linear decline and recovery, but a scrambled mosaic of inventions appearing out of sequence. The lost inventions remind us that progress is rarely as smooth as textbooks suggest, but in the suspicious gaps between invention, disappearance, and return, we sense again the possibility that history has been misfiled, that some centuries may not be where we think they belong. Kings that never were. Amid the fog of the early Middle Ages, rulers emerge from the record like phantoms, some towering in legend, others so insubstantial that their very existence is in doubt. Genealogies stretch into centuries of silence. Kings appear only in a single chronicle, and dynasties seem almost invented after the fact. When we trace these shadowy monarchs, we are left to wonder, did they truly reign, or are they names stitched into history to cover gaps? Consider Dagobert II of the Merovingians. According to one tradition, he was assassinated in 679, his body hidden in the woods of Lorraine. Later stories, however, claim he survived and fathered secret heirs, a myth that centuries later fed into conspiracy theories about sacred bloodlines. For mainstream historians, Dagobert remains a puzzle because so little contemporary evidence confirms his reign. He is barely more than a name, a footnote. Was he a forgotten king, or a retroactive invention used to plug holes in Merovingian succession? scholars still debate whether Dagobert's shadow is history or legend. Another curious figure is King Wamba of the Visigoths. Supposedly reigning in the late 7th century, he is remembered for enforcing discipline so strict that even nobles were required to shear their hair in penance. Yet the chronicles that mention him are unusually hagiographic, presenting him almost as a saintly ruler. Archaeology offers little to confirm his deeds, and some researchers note that Wamba's story reads more like allegory than record. Was he a king or a morality tale inscribed with regal trappings? One quirky tidbit comes from Britain, where the so-called heptarchy of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fills early medieval charts. Names like Ethelbert of Kent or Penda of Mercia loom in legend, and yet the archaeological footprint of some of these rulers is minimal. Coins inscribed with their mes exist, but coin dies can be forged, and many are known only from later monastic annals. Did these kings truly hold the power described, or were they magnified or even created by monks trying to craft a coherent national story for England's origins? Scholars still debate whether early Anglo-Saxon kingship reflects reality or post hoc construction. Even Charlemagne's predecessors, the Merovingians and Carolingians, often appear more ghostly than solid. Gaps in charters, conflicting dates, and suspiciously convenient genealogies abound. Some dynastic trees look less like organic successions and more like carefully pruned vines designed to justify later claims. The very notion of royal continuity may have been less about real kings than about the need for stable narrative. In Byzantium too there are emperors who flicker strangely. Constantine VII, for example, was hailed as the Porphyrogenitus, born in the purple chamber of the palace. Yet parts of his reign overlap awkwardly with other rulers, and his prolific writings sometimes blur the boundaries between his own life and the inherited chronicle tradition. Did he reign as the sources suggest, or did later scribes inflate his memory to bolster legitimacy? Imagine being a peasant in the 8th century. Would you have recognized the name of your king? Perhaps not. You might owe taxes to a local count, swear loyalty to a warlord, or attend church under a bishop. The distant monarch, whose name survives in a single charter, may have been invisible in your world. In that sense, the kings who loom in history may have been more rhetorical than real, signposts placed by chroniclers to make sense of disorder. The problem of phantom kings mirrors the larger mystery of phantom time. If rulers can be invented, genealogies embroidered, and dynasties extended to fit a narrative, then the political history of centuries may be as malleable as parchment. And so we must ask, how many of the kings we think we know were flesh and blood, and how many were only ink and imagination, calendars in conflict? If kings and chronicles can be suspect, perhaps the surest guide should be the calendar itself, the very system by which humanity measures time. Yet in the centuries after Rome, calendars became another battlefield of confusion. Competing reckonings, misaligned festivals, and disputed dates cloud the early Middle Ages, raising doubts not only about events, but about time itself. Rome's Julian calendar, instituted by Julius Caesar in 45 BCE, was meant to be rational and eternal. It inserted leap years to correct drift, anchoring civic life to the solar year. But by the early medieval period, that system had begun to fray. Miscalculations crept in, local communities adopted their own adjustments, and Easter, the most important feast of Christendom, was celebrated on different days across Europe. If even the holiest moment in the liturgical year was disputed, what confidence could anyone have in the dating of kings and wars? Scholars still debate whether these discrepancies were innocent or whether they fed larger distortions in chronology. One crucial figure in this story is Dionysius Exiguus, a Scythian monk in Rome around 525 CE. He introduced the system of counting years Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, intended to replace the older practice of dating by Roman emperors or consular years. Yet Dionysius's calculation of Christ's birth was almost certainly off by several years. Modern scholarship suggests Jesus was born between 6 and 4 BCE, not in year 1 AD. That small error ripples forward through every millennium calculation. Was it an honest mistake, or a deliberate repositioning of sacred history? A quirky tidbit sharpens the point. The Irish monk Bede, in the 8th century, used Dionysius's system to anchor his ecclesiastical history. But when describing lunar cycles, he accidentally allowed for an 84-year Easter cycle to overlap with a 53 two-year cycle. This created duplicate dates, with 2 different years claiming the same festivals. To Bede, it was a puzzle. To later historians, it is a warning of how fragile early medieval dating truly was. Islamic and Chinese calendars, meanwhile, march steadily on with their own reckonings. The Hijri calendar, lunar in nature, begins in 622 CE with Muhammad's migration to Medina. Chinese dynastic records, grounded in astronomical observation, track eclipses and comets with astonishing precision. Yet when these records are aligned with Western dates, discrepancies surface. An eclipse noted in China in 1 year may be matched to a Byzantine record, but the Frankish equivalent places it decades later. Scholars still debate whether this mismatch reflects scribal sloppiness, calendar drift, or something more deliberate: the insertion of phantom years into Western reckoning. Even the famous Gregorian reform of the 16th century, which corrected the Julian calendar's accumulated drift, stirs suspicion. Pope Gregory XIII's astronomers declared that 10 days must be skipped in 1582 to realign the calendar with the equinox. But if the system had truly been followed since Caesar's day, the drift should have been larger, closer to 13 days. Why the discrepancy? Mainstream historians explain it through earlier, unofficial adjustments and rounding errors. Yet for those who suspect chronological tampering, it is tantalizing evidence that not all the years we count were lived. Imagine a villager in the year 700 watching Easter move unpredictably across the seasons. 1 year it arrives in late March, the next in April, with bishops arguing over which calculation is correct. To ordinary people, this instability must have felt cosmic, as if time itself were unreliable. For rulers it offered opportunity, to tie legitimacy to one system or another, to declare themselves guardians of the true calendar. In these conflicts, the calendar ceases to be a neutral tool. It becomes a contested space, where power, theology and politics overlap. And in its shifting numbers, in its duplicate years and skipped days, we glimpse the possibility that time itself is less stable than we imagine. Maps of nowhere. If calendars confused the flow of time, maps distorted the shape of space. In the early Middle Ages, geography became a canvas where faith and imagination filled in gaps that evidence could not. The result is a series of strange documents, maps that preserve fragments of reality alongside vast stretches of nowhere. And in their distortions, we glimpse once again the possibility of a history patched together from invention. One of the most famous is the so-called TO map, a diagram so simple it looks like a child's sketch. The world is shown as a circle, the O divided by a T of rivers and seas, Asia above, Europe and Africa below. Jerusalem sits at the centre, as theology demanded, while paradise hovers somewhere on the edge. To us, it is barely geography at all. Yet for medieval Christians, this was not a mistake. It was truth reshaped to serve doctrine. Scholars still debate whether such maps reflected ignorance of the wider world or whether they were symbolic diagrams never intended as literal guides. And yet, alongside these symbolic maps, hints of real geography persist. The Ravenna cosmography, compiled around the 7th century, lists hundreds of place names, from Britain to Persia. Some are accurate, others fantastical, and many remain unidentifiable. It is a catalogue of both memory and myth, as though the copyist could not distinguish Roman itineraries from hearsay. Was this a genuine attempt to preserve a fractured world, or evidence of later scribes retrofitting geography to match invented timelines? A quirky tidbit comes from the so-called Mappa Mundi tradition, culminating in the Hereford map of the 13th century. Here, monstrous races are drawn at the world's edges, men with dog heads, others with giant ears used as blankets, still others with faces on their torsos. These images were not meant to deceive, but to explain this. Unexplored, projecting fears and wonders into empty space. Yet if maps could so freely blend fact and legend, how much else in medieval record-keeping was a hybrid of truth and story? Arabic and Chinese maps of the same centuries show a striking contrast. Muslim geographers like al-Idrisi, working in the 12th century, drew detailed coastlines and trade routes informed by merchants' reports. Chinese cartographers measured distances with admirable precision, aligning maps with astronomical observations. But when compared to European geography of earlier centuries, the mismatch is glaring. Did Europe truly regress so far, forgetting Rome's geographic inheritance? Or are the Western Dark Age maps evidence of a chronology disrupted, where centuries of knowledge either vanished or never existed as described? Scholars still debate whether the gulf reflects cultural isolation or deeper chronological anomalies. The silence of maps mirrors the silence of architecture. From the collapse of Rome until the Carolingian revival, European cartography seems to stagnate. Few maps survive, and those that do are schematic, theological, or fragmentary. Then, suddenly, in the 12th century, geography explodes with new vigour. Coastlines sharpen, compass use spreads, and Portolan charts guide Mediterranean sailors with astonishing accuracy. Again we see the pattern, centuries of darkness, followed by a leap forward that feels too abrupt. Imagine a monk in a cloister around the year 800, asked to draw the world. His quill scratches a circle with 3 divisions, Jerusalem at the centre. He has never seen the ocean, never left his province, but he has read Augustine's insistence that paradise lies eastward. His map is less a tool of travel than a meditation on faith. Centuries later, historians will treat it as evidence of medieval ignorance, but perhaps it is evidence of something else. The difficulty of reconstructing a world when centuries of records are missing, or never existed. Maps of nowhere remind us that geography, like chronology, was not immune to invention. Where evidence faltered, imagination filled the void, and in that imaginative void, the greatest cover-up in history may have quietly taken shape: the church and the clock. Amid the silence of stone and the strangeness of maps, one institution continued to shape not only belief, but also time itself: the medieval church. In monasteries and cathedrals, priests and monks became custodians of the calendar, the guardians of feasts, fasts, and sacred anniversaries. And in their hands, the clock was not just a tool for marking hours, it was an instrument of authority. To command time was to command history. The rhythm of monastic life depended on precision. 7 times a day, the rule of Saint Benedict decreed, monks were to gather for prayer at matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. To keep this rhythm, bells rang across cloisters, dividing the day into sacred intervals. Over time, mechanical devices were devised, water clocks, candle clocks, and eventually weight-driven mechanisms to regulate these observances. The church was not merely following time, it was creating time, carving it into ordered blocks of devotion. Scholars still debate whether this monastic obsession with the clock was the seed of Europe's later technological revolutions. but the Church's influence extended beyond daily hours. By fixing Easter, saints' days, and jubilees, the papacy controlled the scaffolding of the year itself. When Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1582, correcting centuries of drift in the Julian system, it was not simply a scientific adjustment, it was an assertion of authority over the measurement of reality. 10 days were abolished at a stroke. For some, it was unsettling proof that time could be bent by decree. Did this reform quietly conceal earlier manipulations of chronology? Some critics thought so. Scholars still debate whether the Gregorian correction reveals forgotten adjustments that had quietly shaved or stretched centuries. A quirky anecdote from the 11th century eye illustrates the Church's grip. In Dijon, monks constructed one of the earliest known clock towers, its bells echoing across the countryside. Peasants began to time their work by the abbey's chimes rather than the rising and setting sun. The rhythm of labour itself was now subordinated to ecclesiastical time. Where once the seasons ruled, now the bell did. History itself, at least in daily life, had been rescheduled. The Church also anchored time through relics and anniversaries. Pilgrims flocked to shrines on dates carefully chosen to align with biblical symbolism. A king's reign might be remembered less for battles than for his donation of relics on a holy feast day. These choices stitched political events into a sacred timeline, merging myth and record. Was this sanctification of history also a quiet rewriting of it? Scholars still debate whether the hagiographies of saints reflect true biographies or narrative frameworks designed to fill chronological voids. Meanwhile, astronomy added both clarity and confusion. Monks tracked solstices, equinoxes, and eclipses to calculate feasts. But miscalculations crept in, sometimes placing celestial events decades away from where other cultures recorded them. An eclipse seen in Baghdad might appear in European chronicles, but tied to the reign of a different king. Were these slips innocent, or evidence that Europe's calendar was out of joint? The Church, in its role as arbiter of the heavens, left us records that are invaluable and maddeningly inconsistent. Imagine sitting in a Carolingian monastery, hearing the bell summon you to sext, the 6th hour. Outside, peasants pause their ploughing to note the same sound. Time is no longer just the sun's passage, it is commanded from the cloister. Over decades, centuries, and millennia, this authority accumulates, and when the Church says, "This is the year 1000," who could argue otherwise? The Church and the clock remind us that chronology was never neutral, it was always entwined with power, theology, and memory. In its bells, its feasts, and its reforms, the Church shaped the very skeleton of medieval time. And if that skeleton contained invented bones, phantom years or cover-ups, few would have noticed. Archaeology's silence. If parchment can lie and calendars can wobble, surely the earth itself should tell the truth. Archaeology, after all, is the study of what remains when memory falters: bones, pots, foundations, soil. And yet, when spades dig into the layers of the so-called Dark Ages, they often encounter a peculiar quiet. Entire centuries appear thinner than they should, their traces faint or missing, as though time itself passed more lightly than elsewhere. One of the clearest examples is the city of Cologne in Germany. Under Roman rule, it was a thriving provincial capital, paved with mosaics and supplied by aqueducts. Then, for several centuries, the record fades. Archaeologists find far fewer artifacts dated securely to the 7th, 8th, or even 9th centuries. When the city resurfaces in the 10th, it does so almost abruptly, with renewed trade and bustling construction. What happened in between? Scholars still debate whether the scarcity reflects genuine decline, or whether the centuries themselves have been miscounted. The same pattern appears in Bavaria, where burial sites from the 7th century show continuity with late Roman traditions, but the archaeological record of the following 2 centuries is strangely thin. Pottery styles barely change, settlement layers show little growth. Then, suddenly, in the 10th century, new forms appear as if conjured from nowhere. Is this the rhythm of slow survival, or the sign of phantom years compressed into a shorter span? A quirky tidbit lies in dendrochronology, the science of tree rings. In theory, tree rings should offer a year-by-year calendar, anchoring artifacts with precision. And indeed, they do show continuity across the supposed Dark Ages. Yet even here, anomalies lurk. Certain regional chronologies fail to overlap neatly, leaving gaps of decades where sequences cannot be matched. Most scientists attribute this to local scarcity of surviving wood, but for those suspicious of phantom time, these gaps are tantalizing. Were they merely missing planks or missing years? Coinage provides another uneasy silence. Roman coins circulated widely until the 5th century, their emperors' faces familiar across continents. But after Rome's collapse, coin finds dwindle sharply. In some regions, they disappear almost entirely for centuries. When coins re-emerge in the Carolingian period, they often bear standardized designs, as if monetary systems had been reborn wholesale. Did Europe truly regress into barter, leaving no trace of minted currency? Or were there coinless centuries, never quite so long as later records imply? Scholars still debate whether the numismatic silence reflects lost economies or lost chronology. Even in Britain, where archaeology is particularly rich, silence echoes. After the glitter of Sutton Hoo in the early 7th century, material culture thins, settlements become harder to date, artifacts fewer, urban life nearly absent. Then, by the 9th and 10th centuries, Viking incursions bring sudden vitality back into the soil, fortifications, hordes, and towns. The gap in between feels too long, too empty, too poorly furnished with evidence. Imagine standing in an excavation trench, brushing away soil in layers meant to mark each century. You expect a neat progression, Roman tiles, then medieval pottery, then Renaissance bricks. Instead, you find a stretch where layers thin, artifacts dwindle, and time feels compressed. For the archaeologist, this is not just frustration, it is disorientation. The ground beneath our feet is supposed to anchor us, but here the anchor slips, and yet archaeology's silence may have ordinary explanations. Populations may truly have declined, buildings may have been wooden and perishable, and economies may have shrunk to subsistence levels. Silence does not prove absence. Still, when silence echoes across cities, regions, and centuries, suspicion grows. Scholars still debate whether archaeology reflects a Europe that truly lay dormant, or whether we are digging through a history that was partly written into being. The soil, like the parchment, is ambiguous. It preserves, but it also erases, and in that erasure, the question remains, what if the Dark Ages were not only dark in memory, but dark in existence? Legends as history. When written records falter and archaeology grows thin, legend often steps in to fill the void. Stories told around hearth fires, sung by bards, or woven into saints' lives became the scaffolding of memory for centuries that left little else behind. But in this process, something strange happened. Legend became indistinguishable from history. In the Dark Ages, what people believed had happened often mattered more than what truly had. Take King Arthur, perhaps the most famous phantom of them all. The earliest references to Arthur appear in sparse, almost casual mentions, an obscure warrior fighting against Saxons in Britain. Yet, by the time of Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century Historia Regum Britannia, Arthur had become a grand emperor, leading vast armies and even conquering Rome, Between these 2 points lies a chasm of invention. Was Arthur a historical warlord, later magnified beyond recognition, or was he an entirely fictional hero, created to provide continuity for a Britain struggling to explain its fragmented past? Scholars still debate whether Arthur ever lived at all, or whether he is the most successful cover-up of absence in European history. Another example comes from the Frankish world. The story of Saint Denis, the Bishop of Paris, claims he was beheaded and then miraculously carried his own head several miles while preaching repentance. His legend became foundational for the French capital's Christian identity. But in a period with so few reliable records, Denis the cephalophore may have served more as a political invention than as a saintly biography. Was Paris truly founded on this martyr's blood, or did monks craft the tale to sanctify a city's rising power? One quirky tidbit emerges in the story of Roland, the hero of the Song of Roland. Supposedly he was a knight of Charlemagne who died heroically defending the rear guard at the Battle of Roncesvalles in 778. In reality, contemporary records describe the event as a small skirmish with Basque raiders, hardly the epic of Saracen armies that later ballads proclaimed. Roland's transformation from obscure casualty to heroic symbol reveals how legend was used to magnify gaps in memory, offering a dramatic tale where the chronicle offered only a line or two. In Ireland, the annals are thick with portents, rains of blood, flocks of birds flying backwards, rivers running with milk. These may not be outright inventions, but they reveal a worldview where natural anomalies became historical markers. Lacking precise political records, monks anchored time to marvels, giving the years their shape. Scholars still debate whether these portents reflect misunderstood natural events, volcanic skies, eclipses, or meteor showers, or whether they were added later as allegories to moralize history. Even the Norse sagas, written down centuries after the events they claim to describe, straddle the line between fact and myth. Figures like Ragnar Lothbrok blur into composite heroes. The sagas preserve genuine echoes of Viking voyages and battles, but they also fold in giants, dragons, and divine interventions. For medieval audiences, this mixture was not a problem, it was expected. History was not a sterile record, but a tapestry where truth and story intertwined. Imagine being a villager in the 8th century. The tales told at night were your history, your news, your connection to a distant past. You may never see a parchment chronicle, but you would know Arthur's bravery, Roland's sacrifice, and Denis's miraculous preaching head. For you, legend was reality, and therein lies the problem. When later historians tried to reconstruct these centuries, they inherited not clean records but story worlds. They sorted, copied, and sometimes sanctified them, embedding legend into the skeleton of history. Was this naive or deliberate? Were the monks fooled by their own tales, or did they use legend knowingly to cover the silence? Scholars still debate whether the Dark Ages' reliance on myth was the result of ignorance or design. In the end, legend became the scaffolding that held up centuries of uncertainty, and in that scaffolding, history may have been quietly rewritten. The East remembers. While Western Europe drifted through silence and legend, the wider world kept its chronicles with greater consistency. In Baghdad, Cairo, and Chang'an, scribes and scholars recorded astronomy, politics, and science with a clarity that throws Europe's dark ages into sharper relief. These Eastern sources not only preserve memory but also complicate it, because when we align them with Western records, the timelines do not always fit. The East remembers, but what it remembers does not always agree with the West. Consider the Abbasid Caliphate, founded in 750 CE. Its rulers presided over a golden age of scholarship, translations of Aristotle, advancements in mathematics, and astronomical observations so precise they remain useful today. Historians such as Al-Tabari documented dynastic successions and battles year by year, yet when their records are cross-referenced with Western events, unsettling mismatches emerge. A solar eclipse noted in Baghdad in 1 year corresponds to the reign of a Frankish king who, according to European annals, should have been long dead. Scholars still debate whether these mismatches are mere clerical slips or evidence that Europe's timeline was artificially stretched. A quirky tidbit highlights the difference. In China, the Tang dynasty kept meticulous records of celestial events, comets, eclipses, and planetary alignments. These observations can be dated with astronomical precision today, but when aligned with Byzantine or Western records, certain eclipses appear double-booked, recorded twice under different reigns. Was this the result of scribes misaligning calendars, or proof that the same event was assigned to different centuries in different traditions? Islamic geographers also preserved a more continuous sense of the world. Al-Khwarizmi in the 9th century compiled maps based on both Greek inheritance and contempes, or Rari exploration. His world included Africa's coasts, the Indian Ocean, and China's far ports. Meanwhile, Europe's own maps remained schematic circles divided by theology. Did Europeans truly regress so far while their neighbours advanced? Or does this gulf hint that Europe's lost centuries were in fact never lived? Scholars still debate whether Europe was uniquely stagnant or whether chronology itself is at fault. The Jewish calendar offers another anchor. Rabbinic scholars tracked sabbatical years, fasts, and lunar cycles with care, leaving us a near unbroken sequence of religious observance. Yet when these records are compared with Christian chronicles, occasional dissonances appear. A famine remembered in Jewish sources may occur decades off from its supposed parallel in European texts. Could two communities, living within reach of one another, really misdate the same event so dramatically? Even trade routes bear witness. In the 8th and 9th centuries, Islamic coins, dirhams, circulated as far as Scandinavia, turning up in Viking hordes. These silver links suggest vibrant contact between Baghdad and the north. And yet, Western chronicles of the same period say little about such exchanges. Did monks not notice the silver flowing into Europe? Or are we looking at layers of history that were never written and thus never existed in the way we imagine? Imagine standing in the library of Baghdad around the year 820. Scholars debate Ptolemy's astronomy, merchants bring tales from India, poets compose in flowing Arabic. Compare this to a monastery in Francia, where a monk painstakingly copies a psalm, uncertain of the year outside his cloister's walls. Both scenes are real, but when historians later aligned them, something shifted. The East remembers too much, the West remembers too little, and between them lies a seam where time does not quite match. The East's memory provides not only contrast, but also challenge. It anchors the 7th through 9th centuries in a wider global chronology, making it difficult to simply erase them as phantom time. Yet the mismatches are undeniable, and in those mismatches the possibility lingers. If one side remembered clearly and the other dimly, who holds the truer thread of history? Forged documents. If there is one thread that reveals just how pliable history could be in the Dark Ages, it is forgery. Charters, decrees, saints' lives, many of the very texts that underpin medieval chronology, are riddled with evidence of manipulation. Some were created to strengthen political claims, others to sanctify holy places, and still others to fill gaps in memory. When truth is scarce, forgery thrives, and in the early medieval centuries, forged ink may have written more of history than we realize. The most famous example is the donation of Constantine. According to this document, the 4th century Emperor Constantine granted the Pope temporal authority over Rome and the Western Empire. For centuries, this text justified papal power. Yet by the 15th century, Lorenzo Valla's humanist scholarship exposed it as a fake, its Latin anachronistic, its claims implausible. But the donation was not an isolated case. It was the tip of a much larger iceberg of fabricated documents used to patch holes in the record. Scholars still debate whether such forgeries were cynical power plays or desperate attempts to provide continuity in an age of forgetting. Consider the Merovingian charters. Many survive only in later copies, and suspiciously, they tend to favour monasteries that preserved them. Was every donation and privilege authentic, or did monks quietly enhance their archives, extending lands and rights backward into phantom centuries? Some charters feature rulers otherwise unknown, their names appearing nowhere else. Were these kings that never were, or creations invented to bless parchment grants? A quirky tidbit lies in saints' hagiographies. The life of Saint Brigid of Kildare, written centuries after her supposed lifetime, portrays her multiplying butter and even turning water into beer. Beyond miracle tales, however, her hagiographers carefully inserted dat as and genealogies linking her to real rulers, anchoring the saint in history. Yet archaeology shows little to confirm her era. Was Brigid a historical nun later magnified into a national icon, or was her biography largely invented to sanctify Ireland's Christian identity? Forgery was not always malicious. Sometimes it was pragmatic. A monastery whose founding documents had decayed might compose new ones to preserve its rights, sincerely believing it was safeguarding truth. But in doing so, it altered the record, planting invented names and dates into the soil of history. Over centuries, these inventions hardened into fact, taught in schools and inscribed on stone. Byzantium, too, was not immune. Imperial chronicles were often revised to glorify the reigning dynasty. Genealogies were polished, defeats minimized, and rival claimants erased. If emperors could reshape their past to strengthen their present, why not popes, abbots, or kings in the West? Scholars still debate how much of the continuity we see in medieval dynasties reflects genuine memory, and how much reflects creative rewriting. Even legal codes bear traces of invention. The so-called capitularies of Charlemagne, collections of laws supposedly enacted by the emperor, exist in contradictory versions. Some appear to have been composed after his death, retroactively attributed to his reign. Were they genuine decrees later recopied, or laws invented by successors who cloaked them in the authority of a giant? Imagine a monk in the 9th century staring at a gap in the abbey's archive. The founding charter has been eaten by worms. Without it, the abbey risks losing its lands. So he sharpens his quill and writes anew, reconstructing what must have been there, invoking the name of a king from memory or imagination. He is not in his eyes lying. He is protecting God's house. But for us, centuries later, his pen blurs the line between memory and invention. Forged documents remind us that the medieval record is not a transparent window, but a palimpsest, overwritten again and again. And in its overwritten layers, the possibility grows that entire centuries of history may have been less lived than written into being. The birth of nations. In the centuries after Rome, modern nations often trace their roots. France, Germany, and England look back to the early medieval period as the seed time of their statehood. But when we examine these beginnings closely, we find not clear foundations, but stories stitched together, part history, part invention, part cover-up. The birth of nations may itself be one of the greatest illusions of the so-called Dark Ages. France claims descent from the Franks, particularly through Charlemagne. Schoolchildren are still taught that he was the father of Europe, yet the Franks were once just one tribe among many, their dominance retroactively magnified by Carolingian chroniclers. The Merovingians before them were cast as semi-legendary, their long-haired kings imbued with mystique. Later historians pruned the dynastic tree, smoothing succession lines that were in reality chaotic. Was France truly born in these centuries, or was it back-projected into the void to give coherence to a fractured past? Scholars still debate whether the Franks story is a foundation or a fabrication. Germany, too, locates its origins in the Carolingian and Ottonian empires, yet the word Germany did not exist. It was a patchwork of duchies, tribes, and bishoprics. Chroniclers later stitched these lands into a proto-nation by emphasizing shared descent from ancient Germans, a category drawn more from Roman stereotypes than lived identity. The Ottonians themselves claimed Charlemagne's mantle, retroactively asserting continuity. But if Charlemagne's empire was itself part invention, then so too may be the story of Germany's birth. A quirky tidbit arises in England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled in the 9th century, presents a neat progression: 7 petty kingdoms, the heptarchy, gradually unified into one England. Yet archaeological evidence often contradicts the smooth narrative. Some kingdoms seem more ephemeral than enduring, others may have been inflated in memory to justify later claims. The Chronicle was commissioned by Alfred the Great, a king desperate to solidify his lineage. Was it history or propaganda disguised as annal? Nation-building also relied heavily on saints and symbols. France had Saint Denis, England had Saint George, and Germany revered relics of the Magi at Cologne. These cults gave communities shared identity, binding politics to faith. Yet many of the saints' stories were anachronistic, with relics discovered centuries after the saints supposedly lived. Were these truly ancient traditions, or were they invented to fill the silence? Scholars still debate whether relic cults reveal genuine continuity or calculated invention. The Byzantine Empire provides another example. Constantinople presented itself as the eternal Rome, heir to Caesar and Constantine alike. Yet this claim required reshaping history, minimizing the rupture of the West's fall and amplifying the East's own legitimacy. By crafting itself as an unbroken Roman state, Byzantium erased the possibility of discontinuity, a political necessity that also masked chronological gaps. Imagine being a monk tasked with writing your people's story in the 9th century. The archives are thin, memories faint, oral tales contradictory, yet your king demands a noble past, so you link his line to heroes, saints, and long-haired kings. You prune out rivals, smooth over wars, and extend genealogies. When finished, you present a nation's origin story that feels ancient, inevitable, and true. Centuries later, children learn it as fact. The birth of nations reminds us that identity is not only lived, but also written. In the Dark Ages, where silence invited invention, communities built themselves not on steady evidence, but on narrative scaffolds. And in those scaffolds may lie the greatest cover-up, not only missing centuries, but the illusion that our nations stretch seamlessly back into time, darkness, or design. After wandering through silence, phantom years, and forged documents, we arrive at the central dilemma. Was the obscurity of the Dark Ages an accident of history, or a design? Did Europe simply endure centuries of decline, leaving little behind, or was the record itself reshaped, gaps concealed, years invented, and memory deliberately curated? The answer lies in the tension between chaos and intention. The conventional explanation is chaos. The Western Empire collapsed, economies shrank, literacy dwindled, and survival took precedence over writing or building. Records were lost to fire, war, and neglect. Wooden halls crumbled, parchment rotted, and only scattered fragments endured. From this view, the darkness is natural, the result of collapse. Scholars still debate whether this narrative alone is sufficient, or whether it underestimates the oddities we have traced. For the alternative explanation is design. The Church, the Carolingians, the Byzantines, each had motives to manipulate history. By forging charters, they could secure land. By inventing kings, they could legitimize dynasties. By reshaping calendars, they could anchor authority in sacred time. Even entire centuries might be padded or compressed to align political claims with prophecy. If the phantom time hypothesis is wrong in its details, it still points to a deeper truth, that history in this period was curated with intent. A quirky tidbit underscores the question. In the early 11th century, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry II staged his coronation with rituals claimed to be ancient. But modern scholars note that many of those rituals were actually recent inventions, attributed falsely to Charlemagne. Here, the act was deliberate, not only ruling the present but rewriting the past. Was this an isolated case or a symptom of a larger habit of constructing time to suit power? Design nipped. It'd not imply conspiracy. It could be the accumulation of small, well-intentioned acts. A monk filling a gap in an annal, a scribe misdating a charter, a courtier exaggerating a king's deeds. Each was plausible on its own. But across centuries the cumulative effect was a history smoothed, adjusted and polished until gaps became invisible. The cover-up may not have been a single plot, but a process, a collective editing of memory. Yet chaos remains persuasive. Archaeology, despite its silences, still shows continuity of life. Farms ploughed, children buried, crafts practiced. Dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating provide independent anchors that resist wholesale invention. If 3 centuries were fabricated, how do we explain the tree rings, the ice cores, the genetic traces of plague? Scholars still debate whether these anchors disprove phantom years, or whether even science has its own blind spots when aligned with human chronology. Imagine standing at the threshold of the year 1000, a villager in Saxony. The bishop preaches that a new millennium dawns, that history itself has reached a hinge. You cannot question the year. You have only the Church's word. Whether the count is accurate or not, you live it as truth. For you, the design is real, even if the years are not. Darkness or design? The very ambiguity is what makes the Dark Ages haunting. Perhaps it was both, genuine decline compounded by deliberate reshaping. Silence invited invention, and invention concealed silence. In that uneasy blend, the possibility of the greatest cover-up in history takes shape. Not a single lie, but a fabric of omissions, distortions, and half-truths stitched together until centuries themselves became uncertain. Echoes in our time. As we leave the fog of the Dark Ages, the question remains, why does this puzzle still unsettle us? Centuries later, with satellites in the sky and atomic clocks dividing time into billionths of a second, why do we still worry whether 300 years were invented, misplaced, or quietly forgotten? The answer lies in what the debate reveals about history itself, not only the past we study, but the present we inhabit. For one thing, the idea of phantom years forces us to admit how fragile chronology truly is. Our calendars, our textbooks, even our anniversaries rest on chains of manuscripts copied by weary monks, on charters penned by men with motives, on maps drawn as much by theology as by geography. When we strip away the confidence of hindsight, we see how little anchors the centuries between Rome and the Renaissance. Scholars still debate whether our timeline is sound, or whether it conceals more invention than we like to admit. A quirky tidbit shows how this unease lives on. In 1991, a German museum hosted an exhibition on Charlemagne's 1200th anniversary. Some visitors, aware of the phantom time hypothesis circulating in popular culture, protested that they were commemorating a man who might never have existed. The curators dismissed the claim, but the fact that such protests occurred speaks to the lingering power of the doubt. Even in our own time, phantom years cast their shadow. This debate also reminds us of the politics of memory. Every nation still tells stories about its origins, its founders, its turning points. These stories are rarely neutral. They are crafted to inspire, to unify, to legitimize. The medieval cover-up, if cover-up it was not a unique sin of monks or emperors. It was an early example of something we still do, shaping history to fit the needs of the present. Was the Dark Ages darkness natural, or was it curate? Ed. Scholars still debate, but the very act of debate reveals how history is never just facts. It is narrative. Perhaps this is why the notion of invented centuries feels so disturbing. If whole years could be conjured or erased, then history is not a solid ground beneath us, but a shifting terrain. Our sense of where we stand in time depends on faith, in parchment, in stone, in clocks, in institutions. When that faith wavers, even for a moment, we glimpse a terrifying possibility that the past may not be what we think it is. And yet, this uncertainty can also be liberating. To question the Dark Ages is to remember that history is alive, not fossilized. It is a conversation, a weaving together of fragments, interpretations, and debates. Even if phantom centuries never existed, the very suspicion invites us to look harder, to dig deeper, to treat history not as a fixed monument, but as a living, breathing story. Imagine sitting by the fire tonight, the way a monk once sat in his cloister, or a peasant in a longhouse, or a scholar in Baghdad. Around you swirl stories of kings and saints, of years counted and miscounted, of inventions lost and found. We inherit those stories, but we also shape them anew. In this sense, we are still part of the cover-up or the unravelling of history. The echoes of the Dark Ages remind us that the greatest cover-up may not be whether centuries were fabricated. The greatest cover-up may be our own belief that history is certain. Conclusion. The Dark Ages have long been a canvas for mystery, a time of silence in the records, gaps in the soil, legends standing in for history. Some see in this darkness a natural collapse. Others suspect design, forgery, and even invented centuries. Whether or not phantom time truly exists, the debate exposes how fragile our timelines are, how much they rely on faith in scribes, stones, and clocks. What endures is not certainty, but curiosity. The cover-up, real or imagined, invites us to remember that history is not a fixed ledger of dates, but a tapestry woven by memory, power, and imagination. The Dark Ages may or may not conceal phantom centuries, but they certainly reveal the deepest truth of all, that the past is never fully past, and the stories we tell about it shape the world we live in now.